Total War Warhammer's Vortex campaign and Mortal Empire's maps are littered with locations, some holding particular significance to certain factions by way of landmarks or resources, but there are also many places whose storied history within the source material cannot be meaningfully translated in the game. In this series, we will take a closer look at some of the fantasy world's best kept secrets. The northern fortress city of Har Kaldra is a somewhat out-of-the-way location within the context of Total War Warhammer 2's single-player campaigns. It holds little significance to even the Dark Elf factions in-game, appearing as part of the Naggarond province in the Vortex campaign, but moving to the Iron Mountains province in Mortal Empires. Despite its inconspicuousness, Har Kaldra is the epicenter of a fantastic piece of lore that offers an insight into the insidious relationship between two of the setting's chief antagonists, Malekith the Witch King and his mother Morathi, the Hag Sorceress of Ghrond. Today we will shed some light on why there is more to Har Kaldra than meets the eye, as we explore the lore behind the location. The Age of Restless Spite, third epoch of Malekith's reign as Witch King and supreme ruler of the Druchii, culminated in nearly a millennia of war on the northern shores of Ulthuan, in which Malekith had not only retaken the Blighted Isle, but also reclaimed most of the Shadowlands, his father Anarian's ancestral homeland. He had even rebuilt the great city of Anlek, capital of Naggarith, that had laid in ruins since the Sundering. The military might of the Azure had been diminished greatly by the War of the Beard, a war caused by the stubborn pride of two of the preeminent races of the world, but facilitated in no small way by Malekith's treachery. After centuries of sporadic war, the fifth Phoenix King, Caradriel, known to the annals of history as the Peacemaker, passed of old age in his bed. The Fifth Council were unanimous in their decision regarding his successor, and Tethlas of Caldor, a veteran of the War of the Beard, but more recently the hero who had lifted the Dark Elf siege of Griffingate, ascended to the throne. The initial years of Tethlas' reign saw Ulthuan's armies reassembled to a strength not seen since the times of Anarian, and over the coming century he waged a bloody war of attrition against the forces of their twisted king, pushing them back inch by inch to within sight of Anlek. When Tethlas took on the mantle of Phoenix King, he had done so with a singular purpose: to scour Ulthuan of every Druchii and retake the Blighted Isle from his hated kin. He harboured an immense hatred for the children of Naggaroth, given his family had been slain at the hands of a Corsair raiding party. The forces he commanded marched on Anlek with simple orders. No stone was to be left standing, and no prisoners were to be taken. As brutal as the fighting was here, it was nothing compared to what followed as the High Elf Armada pressed onwards to the Blighted Isle. The Dark Elves were butchered in their thousands as the churning waves on the coast where the fleet made landfall turned red with the blood of the fallen. So ghastly was the slaughter here that many of the High Elves present felt deeply ashamed of what had transpired, thinking their actions little above what their cruel kin were themselves capable of. Knowing defeat at the hands of the Azure once more, Malekith ordered the remnants of his fleet to abandon the Blighted Isle. His forces were broken, their fighting spirit all but spent, and thus they returned to Naggaroth to rebuild. It was little consolation to the Witch King that Tethlas would be unable to savour his victory here, as he passed from the mortal world that day. Mystery still surrounds his demise, but the Azure now lacked his driving presence, and finding themselves weary from over a millennium of war against the Dwarves and the Dark Elves, they too returned to their homeland Ulthuan. Malekith brooded over his defeat, swearing fresh vengeances upon those that had once again denied what he believed was his by birthright. The Age of Restless Spite was over. The Age of Hateful Peace had begun. With Malekith's withdrawal and Tethlas' death, a period of relative peace fell between the Elven kingdoms. The Witch King knew that in their weakened state the Druchii were vulnerable to threats from without, but he was also wary to the ever-present threat from within. His people's pride had been severely wounded by their expulsion from Ulthuan, and he was well aware of the potential for any external threat to precipitate a mass rebellion. With this in mind, he spared no resource consolidating Naggaroth's military might, and sought to reinforce the armies and garrisons of the great cities and raise their defences higher than ever before. This was a task that demanded much of his attention over the long, cold years since his defeat upon the Blighted Isles. But for all the work that was to be done, Malekith never truly turned his gaze from Ulthuan. For nigh on 1,000 years he was content to see Naggaroth rebuild itself into a military juggernaut, just as Phoenix King Bel-Korhadris, Tethys' successor, oversaw somewhat of a renaissance period throughout Ulthuan. By the time he passed away, many on Ulthuan believed that given their dormant state, the Druchii were a race so in decline that they had all but passed into extinction. Rumours even abounded that the Witch King himself had finally died. Rumours that Malekith was all too happy for them to believe. With each passing century, he had sensed more weakness within the hearts of his hated cousins. With each generation, their hearts had softened, and the bloody battles of the past slipped from living memory. There was a certain complacency now where once there had been an unyielding resolve born of constant war. Nobles had cast aside their weapons and militaristic traditions, thinking such brutal acts an ill fit for civilized times. Where once a prince would have proved his worth with martial prowess or wisdom, Ulthuan was now a land overtaken by indolence and political intrigue, in which a silver tongue and quick wit were the primary means of getting ahead. Malekith's lust for vengeance had scarcely burned hotter since his defeats at the hands of Tethys many centuries earlier, but his armies still needed time to husband their strength. At Morathi's suggestion, many Dark Elves travelled in secret to Ulthuan, assuming normal lives and occupations as artisans, smiths and farmers, all the while disseminating poisonous beliefs and allowing the cancerous cults of Exents to flourish once more. But even as the Dark Elf presence on Ulthuan grew stronger, a strange thing was happening in Naggarond. Malekith was fading. It went unnoticed to him, but the same languor that had beset his hated kin in Ulthuan had taken root in his own black heart as well. He was prepared to believe that he was merely playing the long game, waiting for his plans to come to fruition, but in truth he was deceiving himself. Since his rebirth as the Witch King, Malekith had inhabited an immortal body, but regardless, his soul was weary. His very existence had been fueled by hatred, and while he hated the Azure no less than ever, his spirit had grown used to being invigorated by the constant challenge of Ulthuan's armies. Without the provocations of its upstart princes, his spirit had grown dull, and day by day Malekith withdrew a little more from the world. That which was not clear to Malekith shone darkly in the eyes of his mother Morathi. She saw his lethargy for what it was, and beseeched the gods to renew his vigour, sacrificing daily to Cain so that her son's resolve may return to him. None amongst the Druchii, save for perhaps herself, had such a personal stake in their quest for retribution against the High Elves. But no dreadlord in all of Naggarond could even hope to possess the sheer willpower needed to not only mount a meaningful military campaign on Ulthuan, but to unify the sheer hatred and unbridled violence of such a spiteful race into anything resembling loyalty or cohesion. Morathi's pleas and sacrifices had gone unheard by the gods for too long, so direct action was needed, something that would rouse the Witch King from the lethargy of peace. Naggaroth is a land in little danger of invasion. To live but a day there is to live a life in which death and betrayal stalk your every step. This is as true for the lowliest of common-born Druchii as it is for the Witch King himself. Rebellions and power grabs are commonplace between the noble houses, and so Morathi did conspire to create unrest in order to provoke Malekith's wrath and rekindle the flames of hatred within his cold heart. It was a truth she barely deigned to conceal, that she would rather see every Druchii on Naggaroth put to the sword than to see her son languishing as he was. But Morathi had enough sense to realise that Naggaroth was precariously placed with regards to the cold war it was waging against distant Ulthuan. Each of Naggaroth's major cities was important in its own way to the combined strength of the realm. Morathi's own power base in Ghrond was home to the Dark Convent of Sorceresses and a vast repository of arcane might. Haggrave's immense network of mines and quarries provided a near-endless source of wealth and precious materials in order to outfit the Dark Elven armies. As much as she hated to admit it, even Har the city of executioners and home to her most hated nemesis, the Crone Queen Hellebrand, had its uses, for nowhere else was Cain worshipped more fervently. However, one city stood out as a potential pawn in Morathi's grand scheme. The northern fortress city of Har Kaldra occupied much of the landward mass between Naggarond and the Iron Fist Glacier. It was a bleak place, and it was regularly beset by the raving madmen of the north, who would eagerly throw themselves upon its walls in service to their dark gods. For this reason, it had held a reputation as a place that could be relied upon to provide battle-hardened troops when called upon. However, since the erection of the northern watchtowers in the 868th year of the Age of Hateful Peace, year 176 on the imperial calendar, it was rare indeed for these incursions to make it so far into Naggaroth, and thus much of Har Kaldra's tactical importance as a buffer against the tribes of chaos had been eroded. Morathi, deeming this an expendable location in her quest to revitalise the Witch King, grinned wickedly as she envisioned the glorious destruction he would bring about to quell the unrest. For many months, Morathi spread rumours within the courts and noble houses of Har Kaldra, stoking unrest at the apparent impotence of Malekith's rule. The dreadlords of the city, receptive to the notion that they could displace the Witch King and assume untold power, set about their work disposing of one another until only the most brutal among them survived. After a year of bloody conflict within its walls, Har Kaldra was on the brink of total revolt against the Witch King. Naturally, word of this rebellion found its way to Malekith, and Morathi could do little to contain the wry smile that caressed her face as her son flew into a splendid rage. In an instant, it seemed that the Malekith of old had burned its way free of the malaise that had afflicted him. He convened a military council, swearing to make an everlasting example of the craven upstarts that dared interrupt him when such crucial tasks demanded his attention abroad. An army marched from the gates of Naggarond within hours, but the Witch King's wrath was to be felt by the denizens of Har Kaldra well before this force arrived at their doorstep. From atop the Black Tower, Malekith called upon every ounce of his prodigious sorceress might. The skies above Har Kaldra crackled with dark magic and incandescent fury as he summoned cataclysmic energies. An arcane conflagration fell from on high, obliterating Har Kaldra's central citadel and all within it. Thousands died in an instant, and the force from the blast was so enormous that huge portions of the city's mighty walls were flung outwards. The arrival of Malekith's army saw even more misery heaped upon the reeling populace. They were butchered in droves as they offered what meek resistance they could, but far worse fates awaited those that were hauled back to Naggarond in chains. Morathi was well pleased, and for a time it seemed as though her underhanded intervention had elicited the desired response. But to her frustration, this resurgence was short-lived, and Malekith would slip once more into his withdrawn and listless state soon after Har Kaldra's destruction. Even so, Har Kaldra's slight against the Witch King was not so quickly forgotten. And gathering a coterie of his best assassins, Malekith bade that every descendant of Har Kaldra living in the other great cities of Naggaroth would be hunted down and murdered until all traces of the rebellious citadel were no more. It was a task that took the best part of 2,000 years to complete, but in the seventh epoch of Malekith's rule, year 115 of the Age of Vengeance, or year 2415 by imperial reckoning, Takon Drak, last surviving noble of Har Kaldra, met his demise at the tip of an assassin's blade, and the lineage of the Forgotten City was finally ended. Since its destruction, Har Kaldra has remained in ruin. No effort has ever been made to rebuild the city, and the scarred crater and outflung remnants of its own walls serve to remind those of the fate awaiting any who cross the Witch King, and as a testament to his fickle rage and sorceress might. Shards of the city's iron-clad citadel were taken from the site and forged into a weapon known as the Chillblade, and it is also said that when the wind blows from the north, it wails with the agonized screams of those who met their demise that day. I hope you enjoyed this exploration of a location that otherwise goes by reasonably unnoticed within Total War Warhammer. There are certainly many such places dotted throughout the fantasy world that provide fascinating stories and insights into prominent figures within the game. For those of you watching who are long-term enthusiasts or lore aficionados of the setting, do any such locations spring to mind as you play through Mortal Empires or Vortex campaigns? I'd love to hear from you if they do. But as always, thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time, and until then, it's current year. Take care.